Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. That morning, when Toan and Tu Diem were simply clearing the ground behind their house to plant vegetables, they unexpectedly discovered an old iron box buried deep in the soil. Inside were old photographs, a worn notebook, and a silver bracelet that Lam had once kept for the daughter who left the village many years ago. But what they didn't expect was that this small bracelet would lead them to an emotional reunion after so many years of distance. Now, let's explore the story of Toan and Tu Diem together. Could this unexpected journey help bring a forgotten memory back to where it belongs? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. That morning began very normally, just like many other mornings in the small house of Toan and Tu Diem. After a simple breakfast with a bowl of hot porridge and a few boiled sweet potatoes left from the day before, the two of them walked out to the backyard together. Behind the house, there was a fairly wide piece of land that had been left unused for a long time. Grass had grown thick, and the soil was a bit hard because it had not been turned over for many years. Toan said that if they cleared this place and planted some vegetables, their daily meals would cost less because they would not need to buy as much from the market. Tu Diem nodded and brought a small hoe and a bamboo basket to gather the weeds. The morning air was still cool. The sound of birds flying across the garden and the soft wind moving through the bamboo behind the house made the whole yard feel quiet and peaceful. While working, the two of them talked gently with each other. Toan said that since he had built the stone table in the yard, the afternoon rest had felt much more comfortable. Tu Diem smiled and said that at least from now on, they would have a place to sit and drink water after work without feeling such a tired back. They began clearing the ground. Tu Diem bent down to pull out thick patches of grass and gathered them into small piles. Toan stood beside her, digging deeper into the soil with his hoe. The work was not heavy, but required patience. The ground had been untouched for years, so it was quite hard. Each swing of the hoe needed more strength than usual. After about half an hour, one part of the land had already been cleared. When they moved deeper into a corner of the garden near the banana trees, Tu Diem suddenly stopped. She looked at the ground and told Toan that this spot looked a little strange. The surface was not flat like the rest of the garden, but slightly sunken, as if it had once been dug up and then filled in again a long time ago. Grass had grown thick there, but there were no deep roots. At first, Toan thought it was just normal, uneven soil. But when he swung his hoe a few times into that area, the blade suddenly made a dry metallic sound, completely different from the dull sound of metal hitting dirt. Toan paused immediately. He bent down to look more closely and pushed away some of the surrounding soil with the edge of the hoe. After only a few more strokes, a rusty corner of metal began to appear beneath the earth. Tu Diem knelt down and helped him brush away the soil with her hands. Slowly, they pulled out an old iron box buried beneath the ground. The box was not very large, but it was quite heavy and covered with dirt that had clung to it for years. Its surface was rusty, the iron turned into a dark brown color. On the lid, there was still a small lock, though the metal had almost rotted away. The two of them looked at each other in surprise. Tu Diem said it might belong to someone who had once lived on this land many years ago. Toan brushed off some of the soil and gently shook the box. From inside came a faint sound, as if a few small objects were lightly touching each other. They carried the box to the front yard and placed it on the stone table Toan had built the day before. Under clearer light, the box looked even older but still sturdy. Toan tried pulling the lock, but it did not move. He slid a small knife into the lid's edge, but the box still would not open. Tu Diem stood beside him, staring at the box with curiosity. At that moment, Their neighbor Hoa happened to walk past the gate. Seeing them struggling with an iron box, she stepped inside and asked what they were doing. When she heard that they had dug it up from the ground, she laughed and jokingly said that maybe there was gold hidden inside by someone long ago. Her half-serious joke made all three of them laugh. Still, Toan quietly pulled the box closer to the house's porch. He did not want too many people to pay attention to it before they even knew what was inside. After a few minutes of trying, Toan brought out a small hammer. He tapped lightly on the rusted lock. After only 2 taps, the weakened metal lock broke apart. Toan lifted the lid of the box. A faint smell of old metal and damp paper escaped from inside. Both of them leaned down to look. There was no gold or money like Hoa had joked about. Inside, there were only several old photographs tied with a string, a small notebook whose pages had turned yellow, a small silver bracelet wrapped in a piece of cloth, and an old letter that had never been sent. For the first few seconds, both of them were silent. Perhaps deep inside, they had expected to find something valuable. But then Tu Diem picked up the photographs and began to look at them. In one photograph, there was an elderly man standing in front of an old wooden house, and behind him was a piece of land that looked very similar to their current yard. In another photograph, there was a young woman standing beside him. Toan opened the notebook. The first pages contained very simple notes. Dates for planting sweet potatoes, the number of chickens raised, notes about repairing the roof, and buying more vegetable seeds. The writing was short but very clear. Tu Diem stood beside him and read over his shoulder. The more she read, the stranger she felt. The life written in the notebook was almost identical to their own life now. There were notes about planting sweet potatoes, raising chickens, repairing the soil behind the house. It was as if many years ago, someone had tried to build the same simple life they were building now on this very land. When Toan turned to the final pages, the handwriting became weaker. The lines were spaced farther apart. One short sentence stood out clearly. "If anyone finds this box, please return the silver bracelet to my daughter." Beneath it was only one name, Lam. There was no address and no other information. Toan took the silver bracelet out of the cloth. It was quite small, and its surface had lost its shine over time. Tu Diem looked at the bracelet and then back at the notebook. She said the man in the photograph was probably Lam, and he must have lived on this land before them. Toan opened the old letter that had been lying inside the box. The paper had faded slightly because of moisture, but a few lines could still be read. "Father knows you do not want to return to this place, but I have kept your mother's bracelet for you." The rest of the letter had blurred away. Perhaps water or time had washed the ink away. Both of them stood quietly for a moment. Tu Diem said the bracelet might be something Lam had wanted to give back to his daughter, but for some reason he had never had the chance. Toan placed the notebook back on the table. He said that if they had already read this message, they could not pretend they had never seen it. But Tu Diem hesitated slightly. She said they did not even know where the daughter might be now. By late morning, the two of them decided to bring the photograph to old Ba in the village, the oldest person there and someone who remembered many stories from the past. When he saw the photograph, Ba immediately recognized Lam. He told them that many years ago, Lam had lived alone on that land. He had a daughter, but after a sad family incident, she left the village to work somewhere far away. After that, Lam became much quieter. Ba once heard him say that the silver bracelet had belonged to his wife and was meant for his daughter. But after the girl left, no one ever saw her return to the village again. When Toan asked if Ba knew where she had gone, the old man shook his head. He only vaguely remembered hearing that she once worked in a commune nearby, somewhere close to the old market area. The information was very uncertain, but it was the only clue they had. Toan and Tu Diem looked at each other. By then, the sun had climbed high in the sky. Their work in the garden was still unfinished, but the silver bracelet and the line written in the notebook made both of them feel they could not ignore the story. Finally, Toan said that if there was even a small clue, they should at least try to look for her. Tu Diem remained silent for a few seconds before nodding. She carefully wrapped the silver bracelet again in the cloth, placed it back inside the iron box, and kept it with her. The two of them locked the house and wheeled their motorbike out through the gate. The dirt road leading out of the village was quiet at that hour. No one knew that their simple morning of clearing land for vegetables had just led them into a journey neither of them had planned. The dirt road leaving the village ran past the fields and followed a small irrigation canal. It was nearly noon, and the sunlight had become stronger, though the air still felt a little cool because the wind from the fields was blowing across the land. Toan drove slowly while Tu Diem sat behind him, holding the iron box tightly in her arms. Neither of them spoke much. Both were thinking about the same thing. They did not know where Lam's daughter might be now, and they were not even sure if they would truly be able to find her. They passed the sweet potato fields and turned onto the road leading to the neighboring commune. At this hour, the road was quiet. Occasionally a motorbike would pass by, or a farmer would push a cart full of grass for cattle. When they reached the old market area that old bar had mentioned, Toan slowed down and stopped beside a small roadside drink stall built under the shade of a large almond tree. The stall had only a few plastic chairs and an old wooden table. The woman selling drinks looked at them curiously as they approached. Toan took the old photograph from the iron box and asked whether she recognized the people in it. The woman held the photograph for a long moment. She frowned slightly as she studied it and said the man in the picture looked somewhat familiar, though she was not certain. As for the young woman, she said the face reminded her of someone who had once lived in this commune many years ago. However, she could not remember the name clearly. She only said that the woman had once worked at a small restaurant near the embankment road farther outside. Hearing this, Toan and Tu Diem felt both hopeful and uncertain. The information was still vague, but at least it gave them a direction. They thanked the drink seller and continued riding toward the embankment road. The road turned out to be longer than they expected. On both sides were rice fields that had already been harvested, leaving only dry golden stubble beneath the sun. The wind moved across the fields with a rustling sound. After about 20 minutes of riding, they saw a row of small roadside stalls along the embankment. Most of them were simple drink stands where travelers could stop to rest. Toan stopped the motorbike in front of one stall with an old tin roof and a few wooden chairs placed under a tree. A middle-aged woman sat inside, slowly waving a paper fan in her hand. Tu Diem stepped off the motorbike first. She held the photograph and walked closer, gently asking whether the woman recognized the people in it. The woman glanced at the photograph quickly and immediately shook her head. She said she had never seen those people before. Her voice sounded calm, but her eyes seemed to avoid theirs slightly. Toan stood beside Tu Diem, watching her carefully, and felt that something was not quite right. The two of them were about to leave when Tu Diem suddenly remembered the silver bracelet. She took out the cloth bundle and unwrapped it, placing the bracelet gently on the wooden table. At that exact moment, the woman stopped fanning herself, her eyes fixed on the old silver bracelet. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached out to touch it. For a few seconds, the air was completely silent. Then the woman let out a quiet sigh. She looked up at the two of them and asked where they had found the bracelet. Toan told her the entire story, how they had been clearing the ground behind their house, how they discovered the iron box, and how they found Lam's photographs and notebook inside it. When she heard the name Lam, the woman's eyes immediately filled with tears. She held the bracelet in her hand for a long time before speaking softly. She said it was her mother's keepsake. She was Lam's daughter. Toan and Tu Diem both felt surprised but also relieved. They had finally found the right person. The woman looked again at the old photograph. In the picture, she was still a young girl standing beside her father in front of their old home. She said the photograph had been taken many years ago when her family had still lived together on that land. She told them that many years earlier she had left the village after a serious argument with her father. At that time she had been young and stubborn. She left to work in another place, thinking she would return after a few years. But time passed too quickly. When she finally wanted to come back, she learned that her father had already died. From that moment on, she never had the courage to return to the old land again. The silver bracelet in her hand was the last thing her father had kept for her. She had believed it had been lost forever. She never imagined that many years later someone would bring it back to her. Tu Diem sat down on the wooden chair beside her. She said that Lam had carefully placed the bracelet inside the iron box and buried it in the ground, perhaps hoping that one day his daughter would return. The woman did not answer immediately. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. After a long moment, she said that although she had lived elsewhere for many years, she had never stopped thinking about the old land. She had simply been too afraid to return because of the guilt she carried. She felt that she had left her father alone for too long. Toan told her that the land was still there and that he and Tu Diem were now living on it. The woman looked at them for a long time. She asked what life there was like now. Tu Diem described the small garden, the sweet potato field behind the house, and the stone table that Toan had recently built in the yard. The woman smiled faintly. She said hearing that made her feel calmer because at least the land was still being cared for. Finally, she said she was not ready to return to the village yet, but she asked Toan and Tu Diem to do her one favor. If they had time, they could light an incense stick for her father at the village cemetery. She said perhaps one day she would return herself, but for now she only wanted to keep the silver bracelet as a memory. The afternoon was already fading when Toan and Tu Diem left the small stall beside the embankment road. The road back to the village felt cooler as the sunlight softened. They rode slowly, both feeling lighter than they had in the morning. When they arrived home, they sat down at the stone table in the yard. The wind from the fields blew gently across the yard. Tu Diem looked toward the patch of land behind the house where they had found the iron box earlier that day. She said that in the morning they had only planned to clear the ground to plant vegetables, yet somehow they had uncovered the story of an entire family. Toan looked toward the distant fields and said that some things can remain buried in the earth for a very long time, but one day they can still be found again. And when that happens, the words that were never spoken can finally return to where they belong. The two of them sat quietly for a while. On the stone table, the light of the late afternoon stretched across the yard. The day had begun with a simple piece of work, but it ended with the return of a memory that someone had lost many years ago.
Một buổi sáng bình thường, Toan và Tử Diễm dọn lại mảnh đất sau vườn để trồng rau thì bất ngờ đào được một chiếc hộp sắt cũ chôn sâu dưới đất. Bên trong là những bức ảnh cũ, một số cuốn sổ tay và chiếc vòng bạc của ông Lâm, người từng sống trên mảnh đất này nhiều năm trước. Trong cuốn sổ có lời nhắn nhờ người tìm thấy hãy trao lại chiếc vòng cho con gái ông. Từ manh mối mơ hồ, Toan và Tử Diễm quyết định sang xã bên tìm người phụ nữ ấy. Sau nhiều lần hỏi thăm, họ cuối cùng cũng gặp được bà tại một quán nước ven đường. Chiếc vòng bạc khiến bà xúc động khi nhớ lại người cha đã mất và quá khứ mà bà luôn né tránh suốt nhiều năm.